Hi, this is Jack Beam from Beam Legal Team. I'm here with Ryan Timoney, another lawyer on the Beam team. Wanted to talk with you today about hypothermia therapy. The specialty at Beam Legal Team is neonatal and obstetrical malpractice cases. And I think we're the only firm in Illinois that specializes and just does those kind of cases. We've been now over the past years in representing children in 25 states, which by my calculation is about half the United States, and representing children with special needs who were the victims of obstetrical or neonatal malpractice. A positive note is something that the neonatologists in America have done, and that is developed something called hypothermia therapy. So even if the obstetricians and the labor and delivery nurses drop the ball and cause serious injury, there's something called hypothermia therapy that the neonatologists came up with that has saved brain cells. Now, this does not render these kids 100% normal for the most part. They're still going to suffer serious neurological consequences for which we've been able to recover millions of dollars for clients, but it does help these kids to have a better life, have a better quality of life. Hypothermia therapy was first really recognized in this country. A New England Journal of Medicine article by Seetha Shankaran that came out in 2005, and I always think about her. I had the privilege of taking her deposition once. She's based in Detroit, Michigan, and a brilliant woman, and I always, whenever I hear our President Trump talk about immigrants, I think about her, and I'm sure glad she immigrated to the United States to save many, many billions of brain cells for children with her research, and along with many other good colleagues. But what also happens is that oftentimes, even today, even though this great treatment has been around for some time, that the neonatologists or whoever is taking care of these neonates that are at risk are not following the protocol, and they're not instituting hypothermia therapy, and a tremendous opportunity is being lost to make these kids much better than they otherwise would be, and to make their cerebral palsy less severe, their brain damage less severe. Ryan, we've had at least, I don't know how many cases where that's happened, and we have actually sued neonatologists or pediatric neurologists or the hospitals simply for not having instituted hypothermia therapy for one of our children who were born neurologically compromised. What is the criteria that is missed or that we find to be negligent for not doing hypothermia therapy?
Yeah, so obviously hypothermia therapy is a treatment for recent hypoxic ischemic brain damage, and that just means lack of oxygen. So the criteria we're looking for are signs that show, or signs that evidence that the child suffered a lack of oxygen. So metabolic acidosis, that happens when the baby's blood doesn't have enough oxygen in it, and it's a blood test. So we look to the blood tests. We look to the child's condition right after birth. If they're showing signs of encephalopathy, which means neurologic dysfunction, or the great Dr. Volpe calls it a neonatal neurological syndrome. We also look for other criteria like changes during the labor, if there's a sentinel event or abnormalities during the labor period.
Yeah, the sentinel event. Let's talk about what it would be an example of a sentinel event that happens before delivery that should alert the care providers, the nurses and the doctors, to the potential need for hypothermia therapy.
I think the most classic example is probably a placental abruption, or an acute, very fast drop in the baby's heart rate where the heart is not pumping blood.
You're talking about a bradycardia.
Exactly. I think that's probably the most classic example because it's well known that if the blood's not pumping, you're not getting any oxygen.
I always, when I think about the criteria, because this is something that has to be instituted, and historically, the doctors used to say it has to be done with 6 hours. And I got into a real fight once with a doctor on a case out of, I'll just leave it at New England, that was settled for substantial multi-millions of dollars. With a neonatologist, I think they were about 2 to 5 minutes late past the 6-hour window. And they were trying to quibble about, well, we didn't need to institute it because we were a little bit past 6 hours. Now they're talking about extending this, and I knew it was going to happen. They're talking about, what, 12 hours now?
Yeah.
That they'll still institute 12 hours after birth the hypothermia therapy. And there should be no arbitrary cutoff. Obviously, at some point, it's not going to be efficacious. It's not going to help. But that was one of the more ridiculous doctors I've encountered trying to argue with me that it was okay that they didn't give our baby hypothermia therapy because it was like 2-3 minutes past the 6 hours. A little rigid there. That case was, as I said, it was settled for a lot of money. But one of the things we've noticed, and the research I think is still coming in, is that when they have a child with hypoxic injury, they do an MRI typically, or they should do an MRI, a magnetic resonance imaging, to assess the damage. They're seeing different patterns now between a baby that suffered HIE who was not cooled and a baby who suffered HIE and who was cooled. Isn't that right?
Yeah, and actually, it's amazing. The studies and the data shows that when they take these pictures of the brain within the first couple of days after their birth, the cooling actually affects how the brain looks after these injuries, and it slows down the process because you've got to remember, when you get brain damage from a lack of oxygen, it's not the flip of a light switch. It doesn't all happen at once. It continues over time. And the purpose of the hypothermia is to slow down the metabolic rate of the brain and to slow down the disease process.
You sound like an engineer. Did you take a science course in college?
Oh, a couple. I did take a few, and I think it's probably helped me along the way here. But that's the point of hypothermia, and it slows down the brain dying, basically. It slows down the brain death, and that's why there's no magical line in the sand. I mean, the 6-hour time window was developed because that's when the studies, that's just how they created the studies.
One of the things that we've seen with our kids that have had hypothermia therapy, in addition to the different results on the MRI, and even the best radiologists are still trying to get a better handle on what that presentation is going to be like on radiology. But one of the things we've noticed is that, again, the improvement part, the good part of hypothermia therapy, is that it may be the difference between a child with cerebral palsy who does not walk, who didn't have hypothermia therapy, and one who can walk. But there's still going to be cognitive issues and problems. But a lot of those problems aren't going to show up for some time. And we tell parents that come into our office that retain us, or in some cases we tell them just simply to get back to us and just be very vigilant and monitoring the cognition and the reading and the things that will go on as the child gets older, to watch that, because it's still cognition that is being impacted even with hypothermia therapy. So for us, sometimes it's a matter of, instead of filing the lawsuit right away, we're waiting for that child to be at least 3.5 years old to be assessed in terms of psychological testing as far as their cognition.
Right, it doesn't just change the pictures of the brain, it changes actually the manifestations of the injury. Like you said, some of the kids that may have been in wheelchair bound, they're now coming out after hypothermia and walking. And a lot of the actual injury, the dead brain cells and the manifestation, doesn't show up until they're 2.5, 3 years old, and they're not talking, they're having extensive behavioral difficulties, outbursts of anger,
right,
ADHD.
And I think in some ways it's a cruel irony. Those kids are, quote, better than some of our kids who are just so devastated and are in wheelchair bound for the rest of their life. But in some ways, I think it's harder for those children, perhaps, and certainly for their parents, because they look normal, but they have these cognitive problems that when we take those cases and we go to trial, we have to explain to the jury that, yes, this child looks perfectly normal, has good motor function, physical function, but has many serious problems that are going to affect employment and a lot of things, in life. So I would like to leave that thought with you about hypothermia therapy for parents who have either didn't get hypothermia therapy for their children following a HIE incident, or for those who did, to be vigilant going forward, because it still could turn out to be, quite frankly, a multi-million-dollar case, assuming there's negligence and liability. So anyway, stay tuned for Beam Legal Team for more vlogs, and hope to see you again. Thank you.